The numbers never lied. That was the first thing Imogen had learned at 17, sitting in a social worker's office while the woman across the desk shuffled papers with the careful indifference of someone who had stopped seeing people inside their files a long time ago. The numbers never lied. The dollar amounts in her mother's account. The date stamps on the eviction notices. The precise figure of what it cost to feed 2 people in Winnipeg in February when the pipes had frozen and the landlord hadn't answered his phone in 11 days. Numbers were honest. Numbers didn't look away, which was why, on a Tuesday morning in late October, standing in the service elevator of a building that didn't appear on any publicly available floor plan in the city of Vancouver, Imogen Farr was doing what she always did when she was frightened. She was counting floors. The elevator was passing floor 14, 15, 16. The brass fittings on the walls were polished to a mirror shine. There was a small wooden panel beside the button console, inlaid with something that looked like ebony, and it had no scratches on it at all, not a single one, which meant no one who worked in this building carried anything heavier than a briefcase on their way up, or the elevator was cleaned obsessively. Both options said something about the man who owned the top 4 floors of this building, and neither option made Imogen feel better about the interview she was heading to. Her recruiter, a small, precise woman named Audrey, who had handed Imogen a business card with nothing but a phone number on it, had been very clear. This role is not advertised. The compensation is exceptional. The expectations are the same. If you're the kind of person who asks questions about things that aren't your department, this is not the position for you. Imogen had almost said, "What is my department?" She had managed not to. Barely. The elevator stopped. The doors opened onto a corridor so quiet she could hear her own breathing, and she stepped out onto pale grey marble that clicked under her heels in a way that seemed deliberate. Like an announcement, someone is arriving. A man in a dark suit was already waiting. He was built like a question mark, thin at the top, dense and unmovable at the bottom, and he looked at her with the particular expression of someone conducting an inspection rather than a greeting. "Mrs. Farr." "Yes." "Follow me, please." She followed. The hallway was long and nearly empty. One painting on the left wall, abstract, very large, the kind of art that cost so much it stopped being decoration and became a statement. 2 cameras, which she clocked without turning her head. One window at the far end, looking out over the water, the North Shore mountains grey and close in the October mist. The man knocked on a set of double doors, opened them without waiting for a response, and stood aside. "Mr. Vane will see you now." She went in. The office was large enough that it took her a moment to locate him. He was standing at the window behind the desk, not the one on the far wall, and he had his back to her. He was wearing a charcoal suit, no tie, and he was very still in the way that large, expensive machinery is still when it isn't running, not dormant, just waiting. He turned around when she reached the middle of the room. Imogen had looked him up before coming. His name was Dorian Vane, which she'd had to sit with for a moment because it sounded like something from a novel. But the financial records didn't care what anyone's name sounded like, and the financial records that were publicly available said that Dorian Vane's holding company had revenues that made most of Canada's largest institutions look modest. What those revenues came from was not clearly explained. His lawyers had made sure of that. He was older than the one photograph she'd found of him. Mid-40s, maybe, and whatever the years had taken from him in softness they had replaced with something more concentrated. There was a scar along his jaw, pale and thin and old, and he hadn't tried to hide it. His eyes were dark and assessed her in the way that accountants assess balance sheets, efficiently, without emotion, looking for the number that doesn't fit. "Mrs. Farr," he said. Not a question. Just her name, said in a tone that suggested he had already read her file and decided what he thought, and was waiting for her to confirm or deny it. "Mr. Vane." He gestured to the chair across from the desk. She sat. He did not sit. He moved to the desk and leaned against the edge of it, which put him above her eye line and was almost certainly intentional, and she noted it and filed it and adjusted accordingly. "You were a forensic accountant," he said. "Regulatory compliance. Before that, tax litigation. That's correct. You left your last position 11 months ago. I did. The firm released a statement saying it was a mutual decision. That's what the statement said. A pause. She could feel him deciding whether to push on that, and she kept her expression neutral, her hands still in her lap. She'd had 11 months to construct a face for this question. She had it ready. He let it go. For now. What I need, he said, is someone who understands that their role here has a clearly defined perimeter. You manage accounts within that perimeter. You do not speculate about what exists outside it. You do not ask questions that take you past the boundary. You deliver accurate, clean numbers, and you do it quickly and without errors. I understand. I've had 3 people in this role in the past 2 years. The first made errors. The second asked questions. He said it the way you'd say the second walked into traffic, matter-of-factly, with no particular emphasis. The third had a personal situation that required her to relocate. Imogen kept her hands still. And you're looking for someone who will be none of those things. I'm looking for someone who is very good at her job and has a pressing reason to be discreet. The numbers never lied. Her bank account. 11 months of savings, nearly depleted. Her mother's last phone call, which had lasted 4 minutes and contained the words, "I won't be a burden" 3 times in a row, which was the clearest emergency signal in the Farr family vocabulary. Her student debt, her mother's medication costs, the precise figure of what she needed to clear everything and start from zero. "I'm listening," she said. She started on a Monday. The perimeter, as it turned out, was very clearly defined. She had an office on the 31st floor, not the top floors, which were Vane's private residence, and what she understood was a meeting space for the kind of meetings that didn't appear in anyone's calendar, and she had a secure terminal and an assistant named Patrick, who was 23 and deeply incurious about absolutely everything, which she suspected was either a gift he'd been born with, or a quality Vane had hired for specifically. The accounts were complicated and immaculate, and built like a series of locked rooms. She had access to some of them. Others existed. She could tell from the architecture of the numbers, but they were behind doors she didn't have keys for. She did not try the handles. She did her job. She cleaned the numbers she was given and made them cleaner, and she delivered them on time every time. And she went home to her rented apartment on Canby Street and did not think about what existed on the other side of the perimeter. She was good at it. She'd had practice professionally and otherwise at not looking at things directly. 3 weeks in, she came in on a Wednesday morning and found Vane standing in her office. Not sitting, standing at her window. She had a window, smaller than his, facing east with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the city the way she sometimes looked at spreadsheets, like he was trying to find the error. She stopped in the doorway. "Mr. Bain." He turned. He did not look surprised to find her there, in her own office, which was an interesting choice. "The Meridian filing," he said. "It'll be on your desk by Thursday. I need it by tomorrow afternoon." She did the calculation. She always did the calculation. It happened automatically, the same way other people breathed, and said, 3 o'clock, 2:30. A pause. Something passed through his expression that wasn't quite amusement. 2:30, he agreed, which she had not expected, and left. Patrick appeared in the doorway approximately 45 seconds later. "That was the first time I've ever seen him negotiate," he said, with the wonder of a man watching a very unusual bird. "Get me the Meridian subsidiary files," she said. All of them. There are. All of them, Patrick." He got her the files. The weeks accumulated. Vane was not what she'd expected, and she'd expected very little, which she knew was itself a kind of mistake. She had thought cold, remote, uncommunicative. What she found was more precise than that. He communicated when he had something to communicate, and then he stopped, and there was no space in between for anything that wasn't essential. He asked her questions that were sharp and went directly to the center of whatever problem he was holding. He listened to her answers in a way that was becoming increasingly rare in her professional experience, like he was actually processing them rather than waiting for his turn. He also, she noticed, did not thank anyone for anything. It wasn't rudeness. It was more like he'd decided that thank you was a currency he wasn't going to inflate. In November, she stayed until 11 on a Thursday for a deadline. When she finally closed her laptop and went to the elevator, she found a cup of coffee from the cafe on the ground floor sitting on her desk. It was still warm. There was no note. She drank it standing up with her coat on, looking at the city lights. She did not say thank you to anyone, because there was no one there to say it to. The problem arrived on a Friday. It arrived in the form of a phone call from her mother, which was not unusual, and a number her mother mentioned, which was. The number was the amount her mother owed to a man in Winnipeg who was not a bank and did not have the paperwork to prove it, and who had called her mother 3 times this week, and whose associates had apparently introduced themselves to her mother's front door in a way that had left a mark in the wood. Imogen sat in her car in the parkade under her building and did the calculation, what she had, what she needed. The gap between them, which was significant and growing and had a timeline attached to it now, she sat there for a long time. Outside, the rain was hitting the concrete in that particular Vancouver way, steady and patient and entirely without mercy. She went upstairs. She did not sleep. In the morning, she went to work. She did her job. She delivered the Henderson Quarterly at 9:15 and sat in her office and looked at the wall and thought about options, which was what she always did when the numbers were against her. She looked for the assumption she'd gotten wrong. At noon, she went to tell Patrick she was taking her lunch break early, and found that Patrick was not at his desk. Vane was. He was not sitting at Patrick's desk. He was standing beside it, reading something in a folder, and he looked up when she appeared. "You look like something's wrong," he said. She opened her mouth. She had a response prepared. "I'm fine, just tired, early morning." It was a complete sentence with nothing in it. What came out instead was, "I need to leave early today. I have a personal matter." He looked at her for a moment. "How early?" 3 o'clock. "I can finish the Crestwood summary before then. What time tomorrow?" 7, if you need it." Another pause. The folder closed. "Fine," he said, which was the entirety of his response, and he was already turning back to whatever he'd been doing. She should have left it there. "It's my mother," she said, and she did not know why she said it. She owes money to someone she shouldn't owe money to, and the situation is not good. She stopped. "I apologize. That's not relevant to anything here." Vane was very still. "How much?" he said. She told him the number. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's a specific number. I'm an accountant." Something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Sit down, Miss Farr. I'm not asking for." "I know what you're not asking for. Sit down." She sat. He remained standing, which she had by now accepted was simply how he operated in the world, and he looked at her with that assessing look she'd seen on the first day and had since learned to read more carefully. He was running a calculation of his own. She could see it in the quality of his stillness. "The man in Winnipeg," he said. "His name." She told him. He nodded once, very slightly, like he'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. "This is handled," he said. She stared at him. "I beg your pardon?" "The situation." "It's handled." He picked up the folder again. "Take whatever time you need today." "Mr. Vane, I can't. I'm not." She stopped, started again. "I don't accept things I can't pay back." He looked at her over the top of the folder. "I'm not giving you anything. I'm removing a problem that was in proximity to one of my employees. That's a different category. That's a very convenient distinction. Most useful distinctions are." She stood up. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she was angry about that. "What do you want in return?" The word "want" landed in the room, and she felt it. He felt it too. She could tell by the way he went very still again that machinery, not running stillness. "I want the Crestwood summary by 2:30, he said, "and I want you to not make this into something it isn't." She held his gaze for a moment. He didn't look away. She went back to her office and did not cry, which took more effort than she would have liked to admit. And she wrote the Crestwood summary in 94 minutes, which was the fastest she'd ever produced anything of that complexity, and she delivered it at 2:17 and said nothing about what had passed between them, and neither did he. December came. The city put up its lights, and the rain turned occasionally into sleet, and Imogen's mother called to say that the man in Winnipeg had, in her words, decided to let it go, in a tone of profound confusion that suggested she genuinely did not understand what had happened or why. Imogen understood. She wasn't sure how she felt about understanding. She was in Vane's office at 4 o'clock on a Thursday, going through the Q4 projections, when she looked up and found him watching her instead of the document. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He looked back at the page. "You were looking at me." "I was thinking about the projections." A pause. "About the Henderson liability cap. Run the variance at 8% instead of 6. She made a note. She did not push further, because she knew the shape of a closed door. And she had gotten very good at not trying the handles. Later, much later, she would think about that moment and wonder if it was the one that mattered. If that was when the calculation changed. The night of the Calloway dinner, a client function she was required to attend in her capacity as someone who could speak intelligently about the structural integrity of the numbers, and for no other reason, she wore a dress that had been hanging in her closet since a work event 3 years ago in Toronto, and she arrived exactly on time, which was not fashionable, but was her only gear. The venue was a private dining room in a hotel she'd walked past 100 times without looking at directly. There were 11 people there when she arrived, and then there were 12, because Vane was already in the room, and he turned when she walked in, and something in his expression did a thing she couldn't name. She had seen him nearly every weekday for 2 months. She had seen him in a suit and in shirt sleeves, and once in the service corridor in a coat that was clearly expensive and clearly not cared for. She had never seen him look at a door as a person walked through it the way he just had. She filed the observation and moved across the room toward the bar. The dinner was long and complicated in the way that money is complicated. Not dramatic, just dense, with an undertow. She sat between a man from the client company who wanted to tell her about his renovation and a woman from legal who wanted to do nothing of the sort and stared at her phone most of the evening, and Imogen divided her attention between the conversation and the numbers someone had mentioned at the beginning that hadn't added up since. She caught Vane's eye once, across the table, and held up 3 fingers, then made a small gesture with her hand. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the client across from him and said something that shifted the conversation entirely, and the number that had been wrong came back around 15 minutes later, corrected. And she was certain he hadn't done it because anyone had asked him to. Patrick cornered her after the main course. "Did you just communicate with Mr. Vane in sign language during a client dinner?" "I communicated that a figure was off in sign language." She picked up her water glass. He understood. Patrick looked between her and Vane with an expression she found difficult to interpret. He said, which was the most enigmatic thing she'd ever heard Patrick say, and he went back to his seat. The crisis came in January. Not a financial one, those she could handle. It came in the form of a man named Ashford, who arrived at the 31st floor on a Tuesday morning wearing a very good suit and the particular kind of smile that meant he had leverage and knew it. He had documents. He had a name she recognized from the perimeter of the accounts she managed, and he sat down across from Patrick with the manner of someone who had done this before and expected it to go the same way it always had. He asked to see the Whitcroft filings. Imogen, who had been walking past with 2 folders and a cold coffee, stopped. "Those filings," she said very carefully, "are not available." Ashford looked at her. "And you are?" "The person who manages those filings." She kept her voice pleasant. "I'm also the person who knows that your company requested those same documents through the appropriate regulatory channel 6 weeks ago, and was declined for reasons that were explained in writing. So you'll understand if I ask why you're here in person rather than through your lawyers." The smile didn't change, but his eyes did. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Vane." "Mr. Vane is not available. I'll wait." "That's your choice," she said, "but I'll need to ask you to wait in the lobby downstairs. This floor is not a public space." He stood up slowly. The smile was gone now. "You're making a mistake." "I make very few mistakes," she said, and I document the ones I do make. Have a good morning." He left. She went to her office and sat down and breathed for a moment, and then picked up her phone and texted Vane. Ashford was just here. Whitcroft documents. I turned him away. You should know. The response came 11 seconds later. My office. Now. She went. He was at his desk when she walked in, and he looked up immediately. And whatever was in his face, it wasn't the assessing look she'd catalogued. It was something more concentrated and harder to categorize. "Tell me exactly what he said," Vane said. "Every word." She told him. Every word. She had a good memory for language when it mattered, had trained it the way she'd trained everything else, deliberately, and because it was useful. He was quiet for a long moment after she finished. "You didn't call me," he said. "I handled it. You handled it." He said it like he was checking the weight of the phrase. "He's not someone you handle." He seemed manageable. Something moved across his face. Imogen. It was the first time he'd used her name. Not Ms. Farr, her name. And it landed differently than she'd expected, not like a formality, but like something else entirely, something more careful. "He won't come back," she said. "Not directly. That's not how they operate, and I think you know that. He came to see what the perimeter looked like. Now he knows." She paused. "I'm sorry if I overstepped." "You didn't overstep?" "Then what?" He stood up. The desk was between them, and he moved around it, not toward her but to the window, and she turned to track him because that was reflex. And for a moment they were both looking at the water, grey and still in the January light, the mountains entirely swallowed by cloud. "This job," he said, "has a way of pulling people in further than they intended to go. I know what I signed up for. You knew what the perimeter was, and I still know where it is." She looked at him. He was looking at the water. "I didn't step across it. I defended it from the outside. Those are different things." A pause. The rain was starting again. She could hear it against the glass, that same patient Vancouver rain that never quite became urgent. "Why?" he said. "Why what? Why did you step in at all?" "You could have told Patrick to call me." She thought about it. She thought about the 11 months before this job, and the file the social worker had held, and the number in her mother's voice, and the precise figure of what it costs when you don't act, and you should have. "Because I was there," she said, "and I could." He turned from the window then. He looked at her directly, and she let him, and neither of them looked away, and the rain continued against the glass, and the mountains were still invisible, and the city went about its business, 31 floors below them, without any awareness that something was shifting in this room, some calculation being revised, some assumption being corrected. "The Whitcroft situation is going to get more complicated," he said, which was not what she'd expected him to say. "I figured it will touch the accounts you manage. I figured that, too. And," she looked at him steadily, "and I'm very good at complicated." He held her gaze for another moment. Then he walked back to the desk and sat down and picked up a folder and opened it, which was the vain equivalent of a decision having been made. "The full Whitcroft documentation," he said, "will be on your terminal by end of day. All of it." She understood what he meant. All of it. The rooms behind the locked doors. She understood also that this was a form of trust she hadn't been offered before, and wouldn't be offered again under different terms, and that it came with a weight she was choosing to carry. "I'll have the initial assessment to you Monday morning," she said. She left. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the 31st floor and stood in the quiet corridor listening to her own breathing. The numbers never lied. What she felt in that office, standing at a window, the rain against the glass and his name still somewhere in the air between them. That wasn't a number. That didn't have a clean line, or a clear column, or an amount she could record and account for. She didn't know yet what to do with that, but she was going to find out.